Welcome to the College of Complexes. This is our 482nd meeting since we started in February 2009. We put a speaker on every week, a different subject. We require a speaker to take a position on an issue or express a point of view. They have to be for or against something. In this case today we have two speakers, so they both have to be for or against something. Anyway, we give our speaker or speakers up to an hour to make a presentation. If they go over an hour, we cut them off. If anybody interrupts the speaker, we remind the interrupter, we listen only one fool at a time. Then we have questions and answers from the audience of the speakers. Then we have remarks, rebuttals. Everybody in this audience at once who gets 5 minutes at the podium here to respond to the speaker said, or speaker said, for or against. And our speaker gets the last word, gets a comment, close the meeting. That's how it works. So, but before we introduce our speaker, we have time for announcements. Anybody have any announcements you want to make? Now's the time. Come on up here. We want to be able to hear you.
Will you wear your hat?
No, we're okay. My wife has to wear my hat in honor of Veterans Day. So.
All right. Okay, Farmers Branch is having a big veterans, I guess, party at 10:30 on Monday, and they're going to have that. I think they're called, not the Dixie Bells, but they're like a World War II singing group. And who's a veteran here? Just the two of you? Okay. Well, anyways, you guys should go.
All right.
I don't think we're called the Dixie Bells. Do you know what time it is? 10:30. Are you a veteran? You can come.
Anybody else have a?
Where is it?
Yeah.
Come on up
Senior
here.
group or?
Come up to this side.
All right.
Okay. You should come. You're gonna have those.
The Dallas Philosophers Room is going to have a meeting this Tuesday, the 12th. Paul Benson will be speaking about American movements and manias, and Paul Benson's a historian. It should be a very interesting talk. So we welcome you to come. The meeting will be at a Boca's restaurant on Central and Beltline, and it's $5. So we invite you to come.
Any other announcements? Okay, well, next week is Catherine Savers McGovern. She's going to talk about how an impeachment process, not an election, is the only way to comply with the Constitution. It's on your itinerary. I'm not going to read all this. And December 7th, we have Addressing the U.S. Constitution Doesn't Work for Everyone. That's Lorraine Keel. She's sitting right there. She'll be our speaker. She's waving. She'll be our speaker on December 7th. Also, we have Kenneth, what's Kenneth's last name? Williams. He's going to be speaking on December, let's see, November 23rd. He'll be speaking, so he'll be talking about.
November 23rd, isn't that Thanksgiving?
No, November 28th is Thanksgiving. There's another week. Okay, so, there you are. Anyway, our speaker tonight, actually it's our speakers tonight, we have two of them. There's Drumm and Joan Ridley. They're going to discuss on money in politics and gerrymandering, two essential democracy reforms. They'll discuss the benefits of making our democracy more responsive to our citizens as a volunteer with American Primus, and will describe the corrosive influence in our democracy of big money from individuals, corporations, unions, and special interests, and explain why we need a 28th Amendment to reverse the Supreme Court Citizens United decision. Joan is also an active member of the League of Women Voters, and she's a Common Cause and the American Promise. Will explain the manners of partisan gerrymandering, a process that enables legislators to choose their own voters instead of the other way around, and will advocate around the country doing a entire fair maps of the redistricting process begins in 2021. They each argued and concluded expressing our urgent need for reform. So without further ado, I don't know who's going on first.
I'm gonna go first.
And Drumm. And Drumm.
Thank you. Yeah, let's do it that way. All right, thank you, Tom. I'm Ann Drumm. I am here as a volunteer for American Promise. It is a national nonpartisan organization focused on big money in politics. I also want to acknowledge Joan Ridley is one of my leaders in our North Texas chapter of American Promise. Julie Britton is also a volunteer on our Dallas team. So there's 3 of us here from American Promise tonight. So I'm going to be talking about the problem of big money in politics.
Here's your speaker.
Okay. I get the sense that my voice is carrying just fine. Where, though, did my clicker go? I do need my clicker.
Oh, it's back here. Behind.
Thank you. So I'm going to be talking about the influence of big money in politics and why we need a constitutional amendment to fix it and what we are doing to build support for that constitutional amendment in North Texas. Is it okay if I stand here? Can everybody see the slides if I'm standing in this position? Great. All right. So our organization is called American Promise. So what is our American Promise? What do we mean by that phrase? It means that there are several things that are promised to us in our Constitution. That is, that we are equal citizens entitled to equal representation. We cherish human liberty, and we strive to create a system of effective self-governance. These are values we believe in, whether we are Democrats, Republicans, or independents. But there is a problem with democracy, and the problem is the influence of big money on our political system. Our system is out of balance. Those with more money have more political power. They can just buy more representation and more rights than the rest of us. Money from wealthy special interests is drowning out the voices of ordinary citizens. Big money is producing outcomes that fail to account for the needs and interests of ordinary Americans on issues like health care and the opioid crisis, or gun safety, or student debt, or climate change, or American innovation and a healthy business environment. And while those of us in the room share the American values of equal citizenship and equal representation, we have different experiences and different perspectives that lead us to concern about the role of big money in politics. So let me tell you how I got into this issue. This is my father, Bill McDonald, and my son Colin when Colin was 2 years old. And if you, I tell you, Colin doesn't have a clue that I use this slide in this presentation, so please don't tell him because he'd probably be mortified. But I love that picture of Colin in his little blue snowsuit. This was taken in 1990 when, Colin was about Colin was 2 years old and my dad was in his mid-60s. And one of the things the mother and daddy loved to do was rent a condo in Colorado and invite us to come up and join them for skiing. And we bring the kids and we had a great time. But I've become aware over the last few years of the way that the influence of big money on Congress has intimidated Congress away from effectively addressing climate change. The Colorado ski industry is at risk, and they know it. If we get to a point where we don't have snowfall in the Rockies, there will be no Colorado ski industry. In about 30 years, that little boy will be the same age that my father was when I took this picture. And I want him to be able to rent a condo and invite his kids and grandkids to go snow skiing with him. So one of the reasons I work on big money in politics is because I want to preserve the U.S. ski industry. So how did we get to this point? In a series of Supreme Court decisions that includes the Citizens United case in 2010, the Supreme Court has undertaken a radical and damaging interpretation of the First Amendment. The court said that money to influence elections is speech and that corporations are people. And it put those two ideas together to rule that corporations have the right to spend as much money as they want to influence the outcome of our elections. And that we can't do anything about that because those expenditures are free speech protected under the First Amendment. By the same reasoning, wealthy individuals also can spend as much as they want to influence the outcome of our elections. So this has caused money in politics to explode in the last few years. It puts our politicians in perpetual campaign mode, where they have to spend half of their time or more fundraising for re-election. So it's time to correct this series of decisions. It is time to pass a constitutional amendment to correct this radical and damaging interpretation of First Amendment free speech rights. We need to rescue the First Amendment, we need to rescue our politicians, and we need to rescue our democracy. So when we talk about money in politics, we really are talking about three related but distinct issues. I'm going to be focusing on the first one, which is big money. But there's also the issue of dark money, and there's foreign money, and I'll touch on both of those as well. So in the United States, there is a wealthy donor class that provides the vast majority of campaign financing. And this is data from the website Open Secrets, which is data about the funding of federal elections in the 2018 campaign cycle. And so it shows that donations from less than 0.5% of Americans provide 71% of the funding that came from individual donors in the last federal election cycle. Less than 0.5% of Americans provided 71% of the money that came from individual donors. So this raises the questions. What are the priorities of this donor class? And how well do they reflect the priorities of ordinary Americans? Now, big money, of course, does not come only from wealthy donors. It comes from corporations as well. And so while corporations cannot donate to campaigns, they can donate to groups that can spend money independently to influence elections. They donate money to super PACs. They can donate an unlimited amount of money to super PACs, as can wealthy individuals. Those super PACs, in turn, can spend an unlimited amount of money to influence the outcome of elections as long as those expenditures are independent of the campaigns, as long as they're not coordinated with the campaigns. Now, super PACs do have to disclose their donors, but there's another kind of independent spender that doesn't have to disclose donors. These are dark money groups. Typically, these are 501c4 or 501c6 groups that refers to the section of the Internal Revenue Code that created these organizations. So some examples of these organizations that are very active in politics are the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, the National Rifle Association, the League of Conservation Voters. Now, these organizations can also spend as much as they want to influence the outcome of elections. They don't have to disclose their donors. So let me give you an example of one way this can work. This is my earnest young congressman who's just gone to Washington, D.C. He represents a district in Texas, and he really wants to represent his constituents well. And one of the things that his constituents have made clear to him is that they overwhelmingly support the bipartisan background checks bill for gun safety, H.R. 8. They overwhelmingly want him to vote for that bill. But there is a wealthy individual. He doesn't live in Texas, but that doesn't matter. He is absolutely determined that Congress is not going to pass a background checks bill. So what can he do? Well, the first thing he can do is give the maximum to our congressman's opponent in the next election, $2,800. But that is peanuts to our wealthy individual. He wants to do much more than that. So he can give unlimited amounts of money to super PACs. He can give unlimited amounts of money to dark money groups. He can spend unlimited amounts of his own money on radio ads, TV ads, newspaper ads, Facebook ads. So he can spend, the super PACs can spend, the dark money groups can spend unlimited amounts to influence the outcome of the re-election campaign that our congressman is going to be running in, as long as those expenditures are independent. So, what does our wealthy individual do? He picks up the phone or otherwise makes it known to our congressman that he's going to invest all this money if our congressman votes for the background checks bill. So what does that do? That intimidates our congressman. He's really got to think twice about voting for this bill that has overwhelming support in his district, because he knows if he does, there's going to be a tsunami of money coming against him for re-election. But our congressman is brave. He does it anyway. So what does that mean? It means he's got to get on the phone and dial for dollars. He's got to make phone calls to wealthy individuals. He's got to solicit the support of friendly super PACs and persuade them to give money to his campaign or to spend money to influence his election, re-election. Research tells us that members of Congress spend anywhere from 30 to 70% of their time raising money. And this starts on day one, from when they first go to Washington. This is time that they can't spend researching issues, reading bills, creating relationships that might allow them to get stuff done, particularly those valuable relationships across the aisle. Instead, we send them to Washington and they become telemarketers for their re-election. So, under current law, the only piece of this picture we can regulate is donations to campaigns. We cannot regulate any of this other activity, the donations to the dark money groups, the donations to the super PACs, the independent spending, because all of that is deemed by the court to be free speech, and it's protected from regulation. So this is another graph from the Open Secrets website, and it shows you how this independent, this outside spending has exploded in the last few years. So Citizens United was in 2010, right here. You can see that it started going up a little bit before 2010, and then it took off. Here's your presidential election year in 2012, 2014 midterms. Here's the 2016 election year. Outside spending at almost $1.5 billion on federal elections last cycle. So, y'all ever eat Ben & Jerry's ice cream?
No. Try not to.
Well,
Not recently.
Ben Cohen of Ben & Jerry's fame is an ally in this movement, and he has got an unforgettable way of demonstrating big money in politics. Let me play that for you.
Point out exactly what's going on with our current campaign finance system. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to dump some BBs into this bucket. And in this demonstration, every BB equals $600. Here's what one BB sounds like. And now I'm going to pour in the number of BBs that represent how much 90% of the American public donates to politicians. That was nothing. 90% of the population doesn't donate any money to politicians. So what is the next 9% donate? Well, I'm going to represent that now. I'm going to represent how much 10 people in the next 9% donate. That was one BB. The average donation of people in the next 9% is $60, so 10 people would be $600, one BB. Now I want to demonstrate how much people in the top 1% donate on average to politicians. That was 6 BBs, $3,600. And now I'm going to demonstrate how much the average contribution of the top 100 corporations in the country donates to politicians. That was 10,000 BBs, the equivalent of $6 million.
Y'all feel outgunned?
Point out.
So there's another money-related problem I want to touch on, and that is foreign money. So it is still illegal for foreigners to make contributions to U.S. campaigns. But there is a way that the Supreme Court has made it easier for large amounts of foreign money to get into our elections. And it goes like this. If you're a non-U.S. person, you can incorporate a U.S. corporation and have that corporation do business and generate revenue in the U.S. from its business operations here. That corporation, in turn, can make unlimited donations to dark money groups. And those dark money groups can, in turn, spend unlimited amounts of money to influence our elections. They can also donate unlimited amounts of money to super PACs. The super PACs, in turn, can spend unlimited amounts of money to influence the elections. Now, the super PACs have to disclose their donors. But the super PAC's disclosure form is just going to name the dark money group. It's not going to go back earlier in the chain and show that the money really originated with non-U.S. citizens, non-U.S. persons. And under current law, because of the way the court has interpreted the First Amendment, we can't put any limits around these donations from the corporation to the dark money groups and the super PACs and the spending by those groups because it's protected speech. So, we need a constitutional amendment. This is an issue of interpretation of the Constitution. Congress cannot fix it with legislation. We have to fix it with a constitutional amendment. There are several versions that are being offered. The one with the greatest amount of support in Congress right now is the version that was offered by Ted Deutsch, Democrat out of Florida. It's got about 176 co-sponsors on it now, including Colin Allred, one of our representatives from North Texas. And it says that Congress of the states may regulate and set reasonable limits on the raising and spending of money to influence campaigns, and that in setting those limits, it may distinguish between corporations and natural persons. There are other versions, but this is the one that's got the greatest amount of support. Now, all the constitutional amendment does is remove the roadblock that the court put in the way with this line of cases. The constitutional amendment is not legislation. The constitutional amendment will not set the rules. What it's doing is removing the roadblock of the court's interpretation of the First Amendment that keeps us from setting rules. Once we have the amendment, then Congress will have to write the rules pertaining to federal elections, and states will write the rules pertaining to elections in each of the 50 states. And the rules that Texas writes for Texas elections will be different from the rules that California writes for California elections, and that's the way it should be. So we don't know right now exactly what the rules will be, but there will once again be some limits on donations and spending in connection with campaigns after we pass and ratify the 28th Amendment. So, we know it's hard to get a constitutional amendment. It shouldn't be easy. The process is 2/3 of each house in Congress, 2/3 of the House, 2/3 of the Senate, have to pass out the exact same language, and then it's sent to the states for ratification, and 3/4 of the states, which is 38 states, have to ratify it. Now, that's a tall order, but we are hopeful, we are confident, in fact, that we can do this, and this is the reason why. We have the U.S. public on our side. And this is polling out of University of Maryland in 2018 that says what public support is for a constitutional amendment to get big money out of politics. Now, unsurprisingly, 85% of Democrats support it, but you might be surprised to see support from 66% of Republicans and 70% of independents. So there is broad bipartisan support for this, and that's why we think we can get this done. And what I'm organizing in Texas with our North Texas chapter is teams in cities around the region to build support for this constitutional amendment. And the way we are showing support is to ask city councils to pass resolutions. Now, since Citizens United was handed down, 20 state legislatures and over 800 cities and towns around the country have passed resolutions telling Congress, send us a constitutional amendment. In Texas, one city has passed such a resolution. Any guesses?
Austin.
Austin, of
Yeah.
course. And I think that's, honestly, I think it's because nobody's been organizing to get more cities to pass resolutions. Now, a city council can't amend the Constitution, but it is evidence of support in the community. If we can go in to our meetings with members of Congress as we ask more of them to support versions of the amendment like Representative Deutsch's resolution, if we can show them city council resolutions that demonstrate local support, it bolsters our case to persuade our members of Congress. So that is why we are following a city council resolution strategy in cities all around North Texas. And Joan, if you would start the handout around, there's going to be a couple of information sessions coming up. If you would like to learn more about this issue and how you might consider getting involved in North Texas, on next Saturday we're going to have an information session in Oak Cliff, and then a week from Tuesday there's going to be one in Garland, and at the Garland session there will be pizza. So, to wrap up, what kind of democracy can we expect after we ratify the 28th Amendment? We think it will be a democracy where we have more speech, more ideas, more candidates, more participation, less cynicism, and more effective self-governance. No one will be able to spend so much money that they drown out the voices of everybody else. We will have a clear line between the rights of corporations and human beings. We will have elections with integrity, and we will be closer to our American promise of equal rights and equal representation. So I hope you will join me in supporting this, and I am now going to turn it over to my colleague Joan Ridley, who, in addition to being an advocate for the constitutional amendment with American Promise, is an expert on gerrymandering, and she's going to talk to you about that subject tonight.
Do I have to stand?
Yeah, you need to be right there, yeah.
Yeah, because you need the mic. And you might pull that mic down.
There we go, that's good. Can you close that even a little bit? There we go, great, great,
We
great.
can't go all the way down.
Okay, that's fine, that's
She's got
fine.
slides to do.
We're good,
Yeah.
we're good.
First of all, I do not consider myself an expert, but I probably know more than most people about gerrymandering. I heard about it about 3 years ago. Sorry, it's hard for me not to move around. I heard about gerrymandering about 3 years ago, and I was so appalled. I started reading, learning. Well, you know, people were asking me to speak about it because I knew more about it than they did, and here you go. What I'm going to talk about is gerrymandering. What is it? How does it impact you? And if you think it's a bad idea, what can you do about it? So I'm going to give you my humble definition of what is gerrymandering. Now I'm talking about partisan gerrymandering here. It's a process. It's a process of, now this is in Texas because it's different in every state, but it is a process of redrawing the voter district lines by the party the party that's the majority in Austin, which right now happens to be the Democrats. But how many decades was it? It was the Democrats. It's now the Republicans. They do it in closed meetings without our knowledge. We're not invited to see what they're doing. And their whole purpose is to draw those lines so that their party will remain in office for at least another decade. And here's how it all gets started. Now, you all know we get a census taken every 10 years. We're going to have another census taken in 2020. That reveals the population shifts, and we're expecting Texas to get maybe another 3 to 4 seats in the U.S. House of Representatives. They draw the lines, and then I understand I'm talking about partisan gerrymandering here. Racial gerrymandering has been unlawful since when? 1965 with the Voting Rights Act. Lyndon Johnson was president. Partisan gerrymandering is totally legal. It's nothing new. It's nothing new. And you might be surprised to know that it didn't start with Elbridge Gerry. It started in 1789. Remember Patrick Henry?
Yes.
Great orator.
Right.
Not as bright, not as intellectual as James Madison. James Madison, at the time, although he changed his mind later, he was a big proponent of what? Strong federal government. And most of the Virginians, he was an exception, did not agree. They were very much proponents for what they called state sovereignty. We now call it states' rights. Patrick Henry was not a member of the Virginia legislature at the time, but he had a lot of friends who were. He did not want James Madison to win the election. James Madison had just lost the senatorial election. He thought, well, I'll just run for the House in Virginia. Patrick Henry and his friends didn't like that idea because they disagreed. They wanted a stronger states' rights, sovereignty. So he said to his friends, I'll tell you what, why don't you draw these voter district lines so that we're assured that James Monroe will win and not Madison. Didn't work out very well. James Madison got 1,308 votes and Monroe got 972. So it didn't work out very well. Now the thing is, Elbridge, it was at the time, this was a very new idea. Although someone told me over here it started in England, which I thought was very interesting. Now I have to go look that up because I love to read into research. In 1812, this is where we get the idea that started with Elbridge Gerry. He, at the time, was governor of Massachusetts. And their legislature drew the lines, and one of them looked like a salamander. So the Federalist-leaning Boston Gazette picked up on that and said, oh, let's call this gerrymandering. And that's the proper name for it. And that's how it became associated with his name. Now, you might not know, Elbridge Gerry had a very large family. And his descendants are still with us today. And they are really mad at us. Do you know why? We're mispronouncing their name. That's what's got them so riled up. I was out speaking about, I don't know, it was sometime last summer. And I was telling this story. And this gentleman, just raised his hand and said, I am one of those descendants.
Wow.
I said, really? Of course, I'm thinking, did I get all my facts right? Because I'm telling stories about I'm telling stories about their family, you know. And I got to know him, and I introduced him to American Promise, and he is now one of our leaders. And we were very proud of that. And by the way, he doesn't like it when we say gerrymandering. He keeps correcting me and saying, Joni, you gotta call it gerrymandering.
Gary.
So why is it an issue today? Well, whenever you ask a question like that, almost always you're talking about technology is the answer. You would be amazed. You would be amazed at how much is known about every single one of us. Every time you go online and do research about what kind of car do you want to buy, what church do you want to go to, where do you want to go on vacation, Every time I buy shoes on Zappos, I guarantee you there's some record of it somewhere. That information is collected about each and every one of us. They couple that with every time you go on Facebook, every time you make a comment. You don't even have to make a comment, just where did you go? That information is collected. People collect it, and then they are the consultants to our legislators who help them draw the lines, and it's done in concert with some fancy software. There's different products out there that tell them about the distribution of the population, and they start drawing those lines. And the software they usually use is Maptitude, there's Nation Builder, and there's also L2 voter mapping. How does this impact you? Our legislators are choosing us. We are not choosing them, and that's not the way it was meant to be. And it sets up an unfair fight, because the bills that are introduced, the laws that are passed, do not reflect the will of the people. Think of all the issues and the position that how you feel about those issues, and what you know about the polls that are taken. 80% want, gun legislation, something else, and something else. And then you look at the bills that are introduced and what's being passed. There's a disconnect. And it has a lot to do with what Ann talked about, big money. The upshot is self-serving politicians use partisan gerrymandering to further manipulate a broken system. And big money gets them into office, partisan gerrymandering keeps them there. Once they're in there, big money gets them in there, they can keep drawing those lines decade after decade. So why should you care? Because it affects every American. It's un-American, it's a threat to our democracy, and it's a nonpartisan issue that every one of us should be concerned about. Too many elections go uncontested. How many times have you gone to the polls in the last 10, 12, 20, 30 years and notice your side of the slate is empty? Why is that? Because if no one will support a candidate financially, he's not going to be able to win. Why run if you can't win? There was a very interesting research program done at this tiny little college called St. Olave's. Anybody ever hear St. Olave's up in Minnesota?
In Minnesota?
They do some, what's that?
In Minnesota.
Yes, they do some interesting stuff up there. But it was a very interesting research project. It went on for 8 years. They started in 2008, went up to 2016. And what they wanted to know was, is there a correlation between the level of the vitriolic rhetoric and how much a district is gerrymandered? And that's what they found, a very high correlation. Now, this research, and there were a lot of algorithms and math, which is way above my pay grade. But it would be my wish that somebody else, some other larger organization, would pick up this project and continue with it, because I think it really makes the case how the ill effects that this partisan gerrymandering is having. So how many know about these 4 strategies? You know about these strategies? Packing, cracking, kidnapping, and hijacking. There are specific strategies that our legislators use. And they do it in concert with, remember, I told you about the software they use, gathering all the data. Somebody's gathering it, and then the consultants get paid to work with our legislators to draw the lines. Well, then they apply those strategies. And I wanted to ask you, this is the Bible, if you want to know more. I won't embarrass you and ask you to tell me what it says. Oh, you can see it from way over there.
Who wrote that?
David Daly. He's the expert. And what we know is this term was
Okay, Matt, can
coined.
you get back in front of the camera?
Yeah, have a good close look on
Is
it.
this going to be censored?
Nope. I
don't want to cover up his name. This
Okay, we're good.
term was coined back in the 1920s by the gentleman by the name of Edmund Wilson, who was a consultant. It kind of went underground, and it means dirty tricks done cheap. Gerrymandering is the cheapest way to win an election. And you didn't hear about it again until, remember the movie All the President's Men? They used it in that movie several times, and then you didn't hear about it again until late 80s, early 1990s. Karl Rove used it. And that's what it means, is dirty tricks done cheap, because gerrymandering is a cheap way to win an election. So let me tell you a little about cracking. And David Daly talks about this in his book, the different strategies. Cracking is where, let's pretend you've got a district, let's call it District 1, and it's surrounded by Districts 2, 3, and 4. And you only need 51% of the votes to win a district. But if you have, like, you're going to win an election in District 1 by maybe 80% of the vote, that's a waste. So what they do is they draw the line, so they're moving people out into Districts 2, 3, and 4. So now they're going to win 4 seats instead of 1. That is cracking. Packing is just the opposite. They got too many people of a party in Districts 2, 3, and 4. They're going to draw those lines, so now they're evening it out where they're going to take 4 seats instead of 1. And then you've got something called hijacking, and that's where you have 2 incumbents of the opposing party, and you only want 1 to win. All you have to do is draw those lines, so suddenly the houses of those 2 candidates, incumbents, are in 1 district and only 1 can win. And then you've got kidnapping, which is very different. Let's say you've got a very popular incumbent, you do not want him to win, so you just draw the line, so suddenly he's across the street in another district. He now has to go campaign to a whole different group of constituents and start raising money all over again with people he doesn't know. So these are the 4 basic strategies that are used. What should voter districts look like? You're not supposed to break up the counties in the state of Texas. And they say that the perfect compact, and they're supposed to be compact, the perfect compact district would be a circle. Does this look like a circle to you? This is U.S. House of Representatives. Texas 35 goes from Austin to San Antonio. Now, in their defense, I will tell you, this is not easy to do. They worked hard to do this. And this is just one example. We are 7th in the country for gerrymandering, and that is not something to be proud of. We are the 7th most gerrymandered state in the United States. And by the way, our voter turnout, we're 47th in the country out of 50.
Oh, what?
Not something I'm proud of. Okay, so this is what happens with partisan gerrymandering. And this was in the 2016 U.S. congressional election. In the popular vote, the Republicans took 50.4% of the vote, and the Democrats had 49.5%. But look how many seats. The Republicans got 241 compared to the Democrats 194. This is what partisan gerrymandering does. And when we say that the will of the people is not being represented, this is a perfect example. And I will tell you, Ann mentioned that I am a member of League of Women Voters. I was on the board, and I spent all my time with American Promise. But we go out and register people to vote, and concentrating a lot on the students at the community colleges. I almost said junior colleges, boy, that ages me. Okay, but we noticed a lot of them didn't want to register to vote. And they were U.S. citizens, they weren't DACA kids. There was no reason why they shouldn't register to vote. And we asked them, and they said, why should I? My vote won't count. I get teared up every time I hear that, every time I say it, because that is not the country I know and love. And we hear it a lot from the black kids, especially the black men. Inexcusable. So we could increase voter turnout by ending partisan gerrymandering. Now, we don't have time to go into this, but every state has its own way of drawing its voter district lines. Until not so long ago, there were about 37 states that drew their lines like we do, where the legislators draw the lines. We're down to about 32 because about 4 states passed laws to say that they're going to draw their lines differently. California and Iowa are two of the most unique. With Iowa, the staffers draw the voter district lines. They don't use demographics. They know nothing about their people, but they do know the distribution of the population. Now, I'll give them a break here. I give Texas a break. Look at the shape of Iowa. Look at the shape of Texas. We have a lot more estranged borders. We've got mountains. We've got rivers and stuff. Iowa is kind of a boring rectangle. But that's how they do it. And once they've drawn the lines, they go to the legislature. They can vote those maps up or down. There's no horse trading. And if they don't like it, they go back to the staffers and they redraw them. And this has been going on for quite a while. California is very, very different. Back in 1984, they started pushing for an independent citizens redistricting commission, where the citizens would actually draw the voter district lines. And Common Cause worked very, very closely with Arnold Schwarzenegger when he was governor, and they finally got it passed. He was Republican, remember? And look at the impact it had on their voter turnout. They went from, in 2012, they went from 25 to 37% in their primary voter turnout, and they have a 66% voter approval rate. So they're very, very happy with that. By the way, the commissioners, their commissioners were here. They got a grant from the John F. Kennedy Harvard School of Business, and they came to Texas and toured our cities, and it was very interesting to talk to them and to hear what they had to say. You would not have, they have, by the way, their commission has 5 Democrats, 5 Republicans, and 4 independents. The legislature chose only the first 2 commissioners, and those commissioners chose the rest of the commissioners. And they worked through the Secretary of State that sent out a call for applications for people who would like to be a commissioner. They have very strict rules about who can qualify. They had 33,000 applications that those 2 commissioners had to sort through, and they chose them. But it's very, very popular. And compare that to our voter turnout in the primaries. In Dallas County, 4% is normal. In 2018, we zoomed up to 10.4%. This is how what we're doing is discouraging people from coming out to vote. So what kind of impact does it have on how we are governed? Well, first of all, the legislators have job security. In fact, there's a one lady politician in Ohio, I wish I could remember her name, but she calls it the Incumbent Protection Program, and I think that's a pretty apt description. Legislators are not responsive to our needs. People don't register or turn out to vote. Legislators focus more on staying in office than serving us. In fact, they're screaming so loud at each other, they don't even hear us. And you might remember a town hall meeting by a well-known member of the U.S. House of Representatives. And people were asking questions, and it got very heated. He finally said, "You are not listening to me." And excuse me, sir. You should be listening to us. No potential opposing candidate is going to run. And sadly, the way we do things is attracting candidates of questionable intent. A lot of them will run and serve a very short period of time. The real intent is to get a high-paying job as a lobbyist. So we all have an issue that's important to us. What's important to you? Name some. I've missed a few on here because I ran out
Term
of
limitation.
Term limits? Okay. What else? What's that? Infrastructure. What else?
Get rid of all limits on the amount of money you can contribute to the candidate of your choice.
Okay, big money.
Fred Werthesheimer's failed principle from 1976.
Immigration.
Immigration.
Privacy. So the list goes on and on and on. And I will, tell you we've got to get big money out of politics. We're not going to be able to do much until that happens. I worked a lot with the gerrymandering issue until I realized nothing's going to happen until we get big money out of politics. And I will tell you that, did any of you go to the field redistricting hearing in Dallas on October 10th? Anybody go there? Fair Maps is a coalition of some of the biggest nonprofit voting issue groups, Common Cause, Legal and Voters, ACLU, and we just badgered the commissioner, Phil King, until he agreed to have field hearings to come and hear what people think about redistricting. So they came to Dallas, and we're down in City Hall, and they're at the Horseshoe, and 50 of us testified. And I was kind of shocked by the speeches I heard coming from, Mr. King. He was saying how everything they do is transparent, and it's going to be even more transparent. I can show you that's not true. They have, right now, they have consultants that are coaching them on how to comport themselves, if you will, for the drawing of the district lines after the 2020 census. They're telling them, destroy all your evidence, destroy your emails. We want nothing in writing because you are going to get sued, and you want to be sure that you're not going to get caught, because we're going to waste more taxpayer dollars suing and getting sued, and that's what's going to happen. So they are not being transparent, and this is a joke that he would sit there and tell us that. But when I left, we started at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. I left around 20 of 8 that day, and there were already 40 people who had testified, and there were a bunch left yet to testify. So there's a lot of interest in this. What about the Supreme Court? Are y'all familiar with the cases before the Supreme Court? I won't get nerdy on you, but I will tell you.
Just ruled that it's constitutional to gerrymander districts going back to a political party.
Go back to the states. There have been several cases over the years, and the Supreme Court would not hear the cases, said they had no standing. It's baloney. Finally, Maryland and North Carolina, they have been rejected. Their cases would not be heard. They got together, and the Supreme Court heard both of their cases at the same time. Now, Maryland is gerrymandered to favor the Democrats, North Carolina for the Republicans. So finally, they heard the cases together, and what do? They say, Justice Roberts sends it back to the states, and no, this is really up to the states to do it. So you're hearing a lot about Eric Holder and Mr. Obama have formed actually 4 organizations. One is called All on the Line, and they're going out and they're educating people about how to go out and educate people like you nice people about what is gerrymandering. And they were here, last weekend? I think it was last weekend. I was surprised. Not only was it Democrats, but there were Republicans there and engaging. So I think that's very smart, and I'll tell you why. You do remember, as I said, there were decades where the Democrats ran the show. No Republicans wanted to run because they couldn't win. It changed about early 90s. We could go back to that. And I think Republicans are beginning to realize that. They're saying, maybe we should do this a different way rather than all or nothing. So I was surprised. There were Republicans there. There was a study done by Lake Research Partners in 2018. And what they discovered is that 71% of Americans want the U.S. Supreme Court to come up with rules to determine when is partisan gerrymandering being used and when is it going way beyond what should be lawful. But as we can see, the Supreme Court's going to do nothing about it.
Nor should they. That is within their constitutional powers.
What's that?
To make rules.
Leave comments, so.
Let her finish.
Just get let her finish.
Depends upon what part of the Constitution you're looking at.
Well, it's
Okay.
called Article 3, I think, it's Constitution about.
Section 1, Article 1, Section 2. Okay, so let's look at, does anybody know who Thomas Hoffler is? Anybody heard of him?
Tom Heflin?
He died, I believe it was August 2018. He was a consultant to the GOP, helping them, taking all the information we talked about earlier, helping them draw the voter district lines. And he worked with Texas, Ohio, Florida, Carolina, many states. And he died, and his daughter, who was estranged from him, looked at his computer and said, oh my God, there were all his files. And right now, the courts are looking at those files. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of files. 16,000 had to do with his conversations and advice to the state of Texas, to the legislators. Horribly incriminating. And so right now, there's a judge in North Carolina that's trying to decide how much of these files should be considered confidential information. Are they the, who owns them? Should it be the firm?
The estate.
His firm? Or should it be the GOP that hired his firm? So the judge has given them till December 4th to make their case that they are confidential. And the case can be made, those files will be opened up. We've already seen some of them. Abbott versus Perez, that was interesting. All that already, some of that is public. It's pretty incriminating. So we do have bills that have been introduced, mostly in the House. In the 86th session, all these bills were introduced. Victoria Nowdy's in Texas 108. Hers is pretty much identical to what they have in California. Raphael and Chia's is very similar. And then there are others. Donna Howard, every session she's introducing a bill to end partisan gerrymandering, come up with something different. Unfortunately, until this session, that committee had not met for six years. And I will say, Royce West also had one in the Senate. He's the only one. His looked exactly to me like Arizona. They had, I think, equal number of Democrats and Republicans, and then they had an independent that was in charge of that commission. A poor woman's life literally was threatened and endangered. So it's a big fight in Texas if we want to end this partisan gerrymandering. In most states, you have you can collect 100,000, 300,000 votes. Signatures on a petition. And by law, it will get you on the ballot, and the voters vote for it. And then suddenly, Michigan was the latest one to have a new commission. They're still working on the details. Texas is not like that. We have to actually change our constitution, which means a bill is going to have to be introduced. It has to pass the Senate by 2/3, the House by 2/3. Then the entire verbatim bill goes on the ballot. And it will not pass unless 50% or more of the voters vote on it. I would suggest we need to end partisan gerrymandering. As I said before, it's undemocratic, disenfranchises voters, and the will of the people is not being reflected in the legislation that we're seeing. And what you could do is become active in an organization that supports this. Support candidates who are committed to this issue. Write letters to the editor. Write letters, send emails, go and visit your legislators, and promote ending big money in politics. That absolutely has to happen. So thank you very much.
We get nothing out of that.
Well, I don't know, I don't know who to direct it to. There we go. It just wasn't on. I'm not sure which of you fine ladies to direct this to, but I would not vote for anything that had the wording in it may. In fact, I voted against an amendment here recently, a few days ago, because it didn't say shall. If you're going to tell legislators to do something and we're going to give them the order, it needs to be shall and not may. If you have a response on that.
So for the constitutional amendment, Representative Jayapal's version, which is House Joint Resolution 48, actually has the shall language in it. It has fewer co-sponsors. My understanding is that the more things you put in an amendment language, then the tougher it is to get support. So there is a political process at work in determining what kind of language will garner sufficient support to get out of the House and Senate with 2/3 majority. And right now, the version that has the greater support is the version that has the may language instead of the shall language.
Y'all hit gerrymandering and big money pretty hard, and I don't have a problem with doing what you're talking about there. But you didn't say anything about election fraud or voter fraud. For instance, busing illegals in to vote at different polling places. And the election fraud, there was a election in Broward County where somebody was running against Debbie Wasserman Schultz in the primary, the Democrat primary. And he wanted to see the ballots after the election, and they wouldn't show them to him. And so he sued, and they ended up destroying the ballots, so nobody ever saw them. So do you not think election fraud and voter fraud are issues here?
I guess we probably better stand up here to take questions, so why don't we both stand up here? All I can say for American Promise is it's simply not American Promise's issue that we advocate on. So, you know, American Promise is laser focused on big money in the 28th Amendment, and there's a lot of other issues pertaining to democracy reform that are important, but we're simply not involved in advocacy on those issues.
Why?
Because we're focused, and I think that's how you become effective, is to focus your advocacy energy on one issue. If you try to take on too many different issues, then you get spread too thin, and then you become ineffective.
It's also a way for Democrats to hide.
You're not asking a question right now.
I have two questions, one for Anne and one for Joan. To Anne, I would agree with John that the language is not appropriate in the resolution to begin with, because shall is very directive. May is you may or you may not. It's up to you. And so it's just a watered down piece of supposed to be constitutional in nature that allows the legislature to play with it however they wish. If they ever got around to actually writing laws to support what the amendment states. You don't say, well, states may allow some people to vote, okay? They shall, period. And so I don't know why organizations such as yours is not leaning on as many people in the U.S. legislature to get it right, to make it strong, and whatever petitions you might need to put together to make them get it right on both sides. This gameplay in Congress is getting to the point of ridiculous. You can get all the resolutions you wish and bills put together, and they go over to the Senate, and Mitch McConnell pretty much does nothing with them anyhow. Okay, so this is going to stop. If people are serious about having our most important citizens' right protected, then we need to make it loud and clear. So what do you...
So a couple of responses. American Promise is not promoting any specific version of the constitutional amendment. There is still a very live debate among constitutional scholars and activists and citizens about what the language should be and why. So if you feel strongly that the language should be shall instead of may, my suggestion is that you write to your member of Congress and tell them that. And tell them, ask them to co-sponsor HJ Res 48 by Jayapal. So American Promise is supporting the advocacy for an amendment and encouraging the debate about what the amendment should stay. There are even other versions that are being circulated that haven't yet actually been introduced in a resolution. But there is what we are doing is supporting the process of getting to an amendment and getting it out of Congress. So write to your member of Congress and express your support for HJ Res 48. I encourage that.
They're so arrogant at this point. They don't even answer the corner office in Washington, doesn't even answer the phone.
Write to your member of Congress.
So, and the question to Joan, as it relates to gerrymandering and basically positioning legislatures to do what you want, it actually backs into your point too, and about big money. How alive and well is ALEC, the organization ALEC, in Austin at this point? And how active are they beyond promoting and writing basically all the bills that impact big money, big time? How involved are they in behind the bills that pander to the religious right and what have you? Or that's just not big enough?
ALEC is alive and well. ALEC is very alive and well. And I don't know if you're aware of it, but 1/3 of the Texas legislators are members of ALEC. Yes, it's the
American
Legislative Exchange Council, yes. And a third of our legislators are members. And the rest of the members are corporations, AT&T, ExxonMobil, Google, even AARP. And they do write our legislation. And yes, they're very active. In fact, year after year, they are writing 1,000 of the bills that are introduced, and 20% of those actually pass. So they're very, very active. And I commend you for being up on that, because a lot of people aren't aware of what ALEC is.
But ALEC also, their bills are boilerplate in two other states, it's not just in Texas. Yes, but to answer the other question, please, how involved, if anything that you know of, is ALEC involved in some of the legislation they're trying to pass as it relates to social issues and...
To my knowledge, they're very active. In fact, I've got an article I'd like to show you if you'd be interested. But I want to go back to the question you asked first, and I might have to ask Ann the question first. It was my understanding that some of these amendments are really telling the states, you can, may. And that's why they use the word may. Remember that election issues are states' issues. We would not have a constitution or a country if James Madison hadn't horse traded on that one. And that's why we have so many problems right now. It was very ambiguous. He was not going to get that Constitution ratified unless he left it very ambiguous what are states, state sovereignty as he called it, and what belongs to the federal government. And I think that's part of the issue right now. But we have to remember that elections are a state issue. That's why we're having troubles with gerrymandering. And these amendments, at least some of them, are basically telling the states, you deal with it. But it's giving them permission to do it. So you might have another take on that.
I don't know anything to add.
Yes, I have a question. It seems to me that at this point in our history, our form of government under the Constitution does not exist. What we have is people who are totally bought off by this same money that you're talking about, that people call deep state money. And at this point, how can you expect them to vote against all of these millions that they get? I mean, in our first 2 years in Congress, Nancy Pelosi went up $10 million in her net worth. This is happening to all of them, both sides. So how can you expect to really get this done unless there is such an avalanche of individual people that they know they'll be driven out of office anyway. I mean, they're going to lose no matter which way it goes. There are millions and millions and millions every year by being bought off. How are you going to make a change in this?
Well, I think you have the answer as part of your question, and that's the avalanche of people that support it. So how do you persuade lawmakers that they should change a system if they perceive that the system is serving them? And one way you persuade them is to demonstrate an enormous amount of support in their district among their voters for the change. So that's what we are trying to do with our city council resolutions, is to demonstrate support in the district. And, you know, at some point, there's a sufficient amount of popular support for something that they will decide to follow the popular support. The other thing we do is advocate to them about why it actually is in their interest to embrace the change rather than resist the change. And I think one of the most powerful arguments is the amount of time that they have to spend fundraising now. And the fact that that fundraising starts from day one when they arrive in Washington. And, you know, none of them went to Washington to be telemarketers for re-election. They want to do public policy. And so if they're spending 70% of their time dialing for dollars, then maybe they're not perceiving this to be as much in their interest as you think they do. They do need to be reassured that there is a way that they can be competitive for re-election if we do change the financing system. And then that's when I think the conversation gets to some of the other kind of financing reforms, like the democracy dollars, voucher programs, or matching contribution programs. I mean, there's a lot of reform being talked about in the way we finance elections. And we think that the 28th Amendment is actually a structural reform that will help some of those other reforms gain momentum. You know, some of them are getting momentum now, but we think that once we have the 28th Amendment, it will be easier to get some of those other reforms.
And can I just piggyback on that? What did we do before 2010? They got elected, they raised enough money, and you know, it just, the influx of money has just raised the bar constantly. Don't you get tired of getting stuff in the mail? Constantly people begging for money. They don't want to beg for money anymore than we want to hear from them. So to go back to what we were before 2010, before Citizens United, you know, they're going to get elected. It's just not going to cost so much money.
And I don't know if you're aware, it's my understanding that Mitch McConnell has a PAC set up, $3 million PAC that is financed by Russians, billionaires, or what have you. And if that's the case, did they go through the process that you have indicated before, incorporating and then doing the 501c? Is that, and are you familiar with what I'm speaking to?
I have not heard that, so I personally don't know if that's true or not. So I think the question is, can foreign individuals make donations to U.S. super PACs? I have not researched that question. I would have to go ask somebody who's knowledgeable about campaign finance law, and if you will give me your contact information, I will get you an answer to that question.
Yeah, you mentioned before about them becoming incorporated.
Right, so U.S. persons can create non-U.S. persons can create a U.S. corporation and money gets in that way. But whether or not a foreigner can make a donation to a U.S. super PAC, I'm skeptical that that's legal, but I would have to go ask somebody who's an expert. Yeah.
And one thing that was impressed upon me in going to your meetings is the way the process is working in this so-called, somebody said, avalanche of people. It's not something that you expect to do immediately. It's something that's expected to happen down the line because you want to build support. Can you comment on the the building of local support, then state support, and then how many states have already gone through that process?
Sure, and you know, American Promise does have a timetable that it aspires to meet. So the organizational goal is that we'll have a constitutional amendment passed out of Congress by 2022 and ratified by the states by 2026. So in order to do that, now remember Citizens United has been with us for 9 years now. So there's been a lot of activism already. 20 state legislatures have passed resolutions asking Congress, please send us a constitutional amendment. We are ready to ratify. The most recent state legislature to do that is New Hampshire. And then 804 cities and towns have passed similar local resolutions saying the same thing. So there has been a lot of progress made in the last 9 years. And you know, Jeff Clements, our president of American Promise, talks about us being in a constitutional amendment moment. And constitutional amendments tend to come kind of in batches. And so we saw a batch of constitutional amendments immediately after the Civil War in the mid-19th century. And then we saw another batch of constitutional amendments in the early 20th century and then in the mid-20th century. He thinks we are at another moment where there is really building critical support for reform. And this is not the only issue that there is support for reform on, but we think this is a foundational issue. So it is a process, and our job locally is to build the local support to support this nationwide process. And the way you build local support is to organize in a systematic way. And while there have been kind of bits and spurts of some advocacy on this issue in Texas, nobody, to my knowledge, has really been systematically organizing over the course of a sustained period of time to build support. And that's the opening that I saw and decided I wanted to take.
I am a conservative, and ALEC is not my friend. And I think I agree with much of what you are saying here, but I do have a question regarding a new amendment, 28th Amendment. Now, Citizens United is a Supreme Court decision, correct?
Right.
Okay. Does not the 14th Amendment Equal Rights Clause cover pretty much what you would want to do here if it weren't for Citizens United?
Well, the Supreme Court jurisprudence interprets the First Amendment. It interprets the free speech protections. So that's the interpretation that has to be corrected with a constitutional amendment.
But if corporations were no longer afforded personhood and equal status, wouldn't that in itself, wouldn't that correct a lot of this?
Wouldn't deal with wealthy individuals.
Since both parties seem to be anti getting anything done, is there not a case for a third party that just runs on this particular issue, combined with the statement that we will, initiate legislation that favors what most people want? Because,
Well,
That's a political question.
so I'm not going to speculate about a third party. I will, though, point to two other things. Early in the 2016 presidential election cycle, Lawrence Lessig, who is a constitutional law professor at Harvard and an activist on democracy reform, actually filed to be a candidate for president as a Democratic candidate in the primary, as a single issue candidate, with the purpose of getting on the debate stage in the Democratic primaries and giving a lot of national attention to this issue. And he was unable to meet the threshold established by the Democratic leadership to make it onto the debate stage, and the way he tells the story is the DNC kept moving the goalposts.
Right.
So that is one example of somebody trying to use the process to do this. The other thing, I'm sorry, I had a second example. I had a second comment, and I think it has escaped me. If I think of it in a minute, I'll come back.
So the upshot is that both parties are against such things, actually, because they're all, obviously, the Democrats and Republicans, I mean, they're all, like in England, the Labour Party became Tory-light, you see. So you had two parties basically the same, not wanting to change the status quo very much.
Well, there's a lot. Oh, I remember now the second thing I wanted to mention, which was H.R. 1, which was the Democrats' first piece of legislation in the current Congress, which was a big democracy reform bill. Now, you can't amend the Constitution with a piece of legislation. H.R. 1 did have language in it expressing support for the constitutional amendment, but H.R. 1 is inadequate to actually amend the Constitution. You have to do the other process with the House Joint Resolution and the ratification by the states. But certainly it was a demonstration by the Democratic Party that they place a very high priority on democracy reform, because they made it their first bill. So.
How would a 28th Amendment affect lobbyists? And let me preface it by saying that down in Austin, a lobbyist came up to an MD friend of mine and said, cross my palm with $100 grand and I'll get any bill passed for you. Now, that has to mean almost everybody down in Austin is crooked, if that's actually true. So what would the 28th Amendment, how would that affect the case of lobbyists?
I think that depends on how the legislature writes the legislation. Again, all the constitutional amendment does is remove the roadblock that is right now preventing the legislature from writing legislation. So the details need to be determined by the legislature.
Well, I think our friend John here has gotten at the heart of the issue obliquely, though. The question I would pose is, how much do you think it would take Congress to vote against their own self-interests?
How much would it take?
Yes, either persuasion, money, or inducement, or consideration.
Well, it's like we talked about before, is demonstrating a high amount of public support for a constitutional amendment and advocacy that persuades them that supporting the amendment is something that's in their interest and not antithetical to their interests. And I think we know right now, given the amount of support for House Joint Resolution 2, that at least 175 members of the U.S. House of Representatives thinks it's in their interest to pass a constitutional amendment. So we still have some work to do, because that's not 2/3 of the House, but that's a lot who agree with us.
I think you're still good, as we say down south, whistling Dixie upwind. The problem is Congress, until Congress has their guaranteed re-election aborted, that's probably a good word for it. If that's through term limitations, I think you guys are wasting a lot of hot air and money thinking you can get Congress to reform itself. You think you're going to persuade them it's in their best interest? I don't think you have enough dollars to do it. The best place for this discussion is, like you say, between activists and academics in journals, because this will never get through. The only thing that might work is if you follow the Constitution. I know you all don't like to do that. You want to interpret it by the Supreme Court. But there are two other ways to get this done, if indeed you had the support. One would is, and I have two questions for you coming up. One is, a president can call a constitutional convention without the permission of Congress. Would your organization support that? And secondly, there is the states can call for a constitutional convention. So if you claim all these people support this, why don't you go around to get the states, like some other viewpoints have done on this immigration law?
Okay, so it's a good point. There is an alternative process in the Constitution under Article 5 that allows 2/3 of the states to call a convention for the purposes of considering an amendment, and if they pass the amendment and 3/4 of the states ratify it, then it becomes part of the Constitution. Now, I don't think it's true that the president can call a constitutional convention, and in fact, one of the interesting things about this process is that it doesn't involve the president. 2/3 of Congress and 3/4 of the states agree, it becomes part of the Constitution. The president doesn't have anything to do with that process.
That's a separate path. Two-thirds of Congress, I think you're smoking something in addition to whistling Dixie up there. 2/3 of the Congress, as is presently constituted, is never going to support that. The only way you might get support 2/3 of Congress is if you can stop the automatic re-election procedures that have term limitation.
Okay. I hear your strong support for term limits. Yeah.
Can I make a comment? I don't see anybody here under the age of 30.
Hey.
And
We're not talking about mental age now.
We need to be aware that there's a younger generation coming up, and they are not going to sit still for a lot of this stuff that's going on now. Ann and I were at the National American Promise Conference, was it 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago? What do we have, 25%? People there were, what, under the age of 30? Oh my gosh. These kids are serious. They are serious. And I would not have much hope, and I'm hearing that from a lot of you, except to watch these kids. They are not going to sit still for a lot of this nonsense that the old white guys are telling them. And I think that we need to accord them some respect and support them as much as we can if we want to see change in this country.
I agree.
I've been listening to you talk about the funding coming in through these different sources to the candidates and how it affects our laws and legislation. I'm trying to articulate my question at the point, have you heard anything or discussed anything at the juncture of honing in on those particular candidates with disclosure? We have this joke, they all need NASCAR vests to show who bought and paid for their election while they're up talking, so you can see how full of BS they really are. Is there anything that you guys have heard banding around in this? I may be way off in left field here, but...
If you're far enough in left field, you'll be on the right field.
Okay, I'm really trying to do a question, stay in the format here. Have you guys had anything with disclosure on the individual candidates in this while you're trying to deal with big money in politics? We used to have news meet. You can tease somebody up and see who donated to who. Is anybody trying to get that disclosure in that dark money?
Okay, so yes. First of all, disclosure is completely constitutional, and the Supreme Court made it clear that it does not have a problem with disclosure laws. So where we don't have disclosure, like in the dark money groups, that's really a problem of political will. It is not a problem of constitutional jurisprudence. However, Representative Jayapal's version, House Joint Resolution 48, does mandate disclosure. So if you want that to be part of your resolution along with the shall language, then that is the version you should ask your representative to support. Also, there are outside interests that are working to provide as much information available to voters as possible. One of them is this Open Secrets website that I cited twice, which does research on federal elections. But there's also a guy in Texas named Chris Tackett who's doing a lot of research about who's funding who in the state legislature. Joan has heard him speak. I haven't heard him speak yet, but he's getting a lot of attention for the information, the data that he is publishing about the money flow in Texas politics. Do you want to add to that, Joan?
Yeah, I do.
Excellent.
Chris Tackett is speaking next Monday night at MetroCrest Democrats. They meet on Beltline. And I'm going to go here and speak because he is totally working on a volunteer basis. I think he has a full-time job.
Beltline's a big street. Do you have a cross street?
I do not, but if you go, just Google MetroCrest Democrats, you'll see where they meet. They meet at 6:30 at,
Near Midway?
I'm going to look it up.
yes, I can't remember the name of the restaurant, but,
New buffet.
but it,
New buffet.
New Buffet, that's it,
Chinese.
NEW Buffet, that's the name of it, it's an Asian restaurant. But I suggest you go, because he is gonna talk about its sources of information and that sort of thing. But we use this website, because we do research before we go talk to our city councilman, and he's been a tremendous source of, we want to know who's funding them, and he's provided a lot of that information.
It's on the MetroCrest Democrats. I'm sorry, I just got a hold of a pen. Did you say that they were on Monday?
Next Monday, he's speaking at 6:30.
Thank you so much.
But double check it because, isn't that Veterans Day?
That's,
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure
that's
that's the day they're meeting, but you want to double check that.
Thank you so much.
Any more questions?
Yes. I like what you said about your expecting the younger people to really rise up and not take this stuff, except that I remember you having said that they're not even voting or signing up to vote, number one. And number two, with the meltdown of our educational system, which has absolutely been by design, how many of them have ever read the Constitution or studied American history and known what the Founding Fathers had in their hearts and their minds when they founded this country? And why they founded it?
You know, I have to, okay, when we go out to register people to vote, it's the black kids that don't want to register. It's a very specific segment, and of course the DACA kids can't. But the ones that we're seeing who are getting active, they're the ones who are taking poli-sci and history, and they are learning, and I think, I don't know what came first, the chicken or the egg. Maybe that's what's motivating them, but they have a passion for this sort of thing. And they're the ones, and will tell you, they are hopping mad about what's going on with climate change, like nothing's happening. They're the ones, as you well know, what's that girl's name in Sweden?
Greta
Yes, perfect example. Look at the kids who are behind wanting background checks for guns. It's the kids that are driving these, hopefully some changes, some smart changes, you know. So anyway, yes, they aren't all what we hear about. They are learning and they are motivating. They are getting out there mobilizing.
And as it relates to disclosure, it was my understanding, and I may get the 501s confused here, that when this first came out, yes, they had to disclose who was donating to these PACs and what have you. And apparently they weren't disclosing that, and they went to Congress and said, the IRS, sorry, I meant to say, the IRS went to Congress and said, we're not getting this information, particularly from the Republican-backed PACs at the time. And Congress just told them to go away and stop bothering people. And is that the kind of pushback that you were referring to as it relates to not enforcing what's behind what they're supposed to disclose?
Well, actually, Congress could just amend the Internal Revenue Code and require disclosure.
Yeah, but that, which is supposed to be
they've not done.
Oh, yeah, that's not.
So so this is not an area I'm expert in. My understanding is that there is certain kind of disclosure that the 501 groups have to make to the Internal Revenue Code.
Correct.
I mean, to the IRS. It is not a public disclosure.
No, no.
It is, I believe that the intention is for the IRS to determine whether or not the organizations are actually following the law with respect to the amount of political activity they're allowed to engage in. Because see, a 501c3 is an educational organization. It's not supposed to engage in very much political activity. If it kind of exceeds that threshold, it needs to be a 501c4. And the primary difference between that is that your donations to a C3 are deductible, your donations to a C4 are not deductible. So there is an enforcement aspect of this that requires disclosure by the organizations to the IRS that is not public information.
No, I understand, but they weren't even giving it to the IRS, and the IRS went to Congress. This was shortly after Citizens United.
Yeah, I don't really know the story behind that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The first question I have is, if I were to give you a list of 5 major topics that have come up tonight, would you be willing to rank them from most important to least important?
You mean my personal ranking?
No, yeah, you or what you think your organization might do.
Well, now, the organization isn't going to rank other issues. That's just not what American Promise does.
Well, that's their best Achilles heel, because this problem is complex and has many tentacles. And you have to solve 2 or 3 things simultaneously. But yeah, I mean, how about you two? Would you be willing to rank the 5?
Well, are you talking about substantive issues like
Yes.
some of the ones we have addressed?
Yes.
So tell me why that is important information for you to have.
Well, it is called values clarification. It was what the progressive educators used with elementary kids starting in the 2nd grade. So with all of you guys' experience in education, I thought you wouldn't be intimidated by it. But if you don't want to answer, that's okay.
Well, you know, it kind of feels like a gotcha setup. You know,
It's just value clarification.
So
I would give you my opinion. I'm writing for you.
I told you that the issue that brings me to democracy reform is climate change. And
that's not one of the 5.
that's the one that I care about. I mean, I care about a lot of issues, but that is at the top of my list.
I do too. Okay, well, if this is too challenging for you, you
Don't
spoke.
have to be condescending.
Yeah, you're being very
Your whole talk was condescending. Your whole talk was condescending.
Why are we
But
baiting?
you talk about yes, I do, if you'll,
Okay, you could have handled this.
here's another question. You talk about revealing the identity of all these secret donors. You know, probably your favorite state of California, been on a couple of recent initiative and referendums. And by the way, I think that's a good idea. Initiative and referendum, we ought to have it in Texas, but the Democrats blocked it when the Republican government wanted to put it up. Anyway, back to California. There were a couple of recent issues that when people's identities were revealed, they were physically attacked, and some of them lost their CEO. So the question is, how would you protect those people? If you're going to reveal everybody's identity, how are you going to protect them from retaliation, which has already happened since the last 10 years?
So you are talking about disclosure.
Yes.
Okay, you're talking.
And I think disclosure is a general principle is a good idea. But how do you protect people, their privacy, their physical safety, and from losing their jobs?
And I'm going to go back to my answer that American Promise is laser focused on big money in politics. And the observation that the Supreme Court has said that disclosure is constitutional. And so I'm not going to go deeply into a debate about the wisdom of disclosure because
let her at least finish her comment.
Not the issue that we advocate on.
Well, that's why your movement will fail.
Okay, that
That's less
is
question.
uncalled for.
But I
That
think
is
getting
really
back to
uncalled for.
Ann's point, there are lots of very, 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 very important issues. And we've just chosen to focus on one, but there are other organizations out there that are laser focused on other important issues. So every organization is not going to be effective if they're focusing on several issues at one time.
Shotgun approach.
Okay.
I think we're out of
Okay,
questions.
I think we're out of questions.
Now it's your turn to talk, so you get 5 minutes up here, whoever wants to say either for or against what the speaker said to say. And come on up here and make your point. Your 5 minutes.
I would like to thank the two presenters. This, you said a president. We've never had this before.
Oh, really?
So it's the first time we've had two people presenting at the same time. I thank you for your observations, and I understand as you're explaining, the organization is focused on. I'm really concerned about the impact the Citizens United has had. And I don't think if you read the Federalist paper, that was not unfair, that was money was supposed to control it, although most of the people who were at the Constitutional Convention were wealthy people, but they seemed to think beyond just being wealthy. So I don't know why they made the decision, but they did. Sometimes I get pessimistic. I work at a junior college part-time. I've been retired for 20-something years. And I have to do something to keep my mind working, otherwise I'm moving in that direction anyway, but I have to do something. And working with young kids, children, and as junior college level is challenging and interesting. And I've been doing it for 20 years. But I'm a deputy register, so when I go to a class, I say, if any of you, how many are 18? They raise their hand. Are you registered to vote? They say they are. I don't know whether they are or not. I never noticed a distinction between African American young fellows, but in the high schools in Dallas, they don't teach civics, it's an elective. And they do teach American history, but not civics. And they don't teach economics is elective too. And that's two areas that our young people are limited, very, very limited. They don't really understand what's going on politically. I was optimistic with the Occupy Wall Street thing that happened in 2012. I thought that was the movement. I've been trying to force young people to get involved. I said, you know, we old folks, and I've been beating on a pretty heavy issue, have leaving you a $23 trillion debt that you're going to have to pay, and you didn't benefit from it. So you ought to be interested in politics, but nothing else, because of that reason. And I see the movement in the background checks for young people and in the environment. I don't know about what the gentleman in the back is covering. The environment is critical problems, and things have been happening in the last few years. This has not happened in my life, and I've been here a long time, 82 years. And so I've seen lots. And my field was political science and economics. And so I've been always a political junkie. And so some of the things are, the young people seem to get involved, and I hope they'll get more, because older folks we're going to change too much. And I'm convinced that we're so polarized, and that's what we got to overcome, the polarization in this country, that everybody is divided and fighting among themselves, and the people with money is going here and doing what they want to do at our expense. These companies that make all these contributions, they get the money from us for the price they sell their products for. We enable them to do things that's against our interests. It's because we're so polarized and bogged down in peripheral issues that really are no major issues. I know it's an issue to you or to the people, but that's where the problem is. It's hard to get an overflow of people in for one issue because of the polarization. And many of the politicians build on polarization. So that's where I think we need to focus on. I do think we're in serious trouble in the ecosystem. And I do think the problems are man-created. We created the problem. And so we created by pumping all this current stuff in the air that is causing differences in our climate today than what it was years ago. Thank you.
Who's next? Okay, I get it.
here.
Well, I want to thank the speakers for bringing this information to us, and I'd really like to censure some of the behavior that's gone on here, because it really was disrespectful, and I don't think we need to have meetings where you're making deprecatory comments about the speakers. We're here as a group
Acerbic
to...
comments are not breaches of etiquette.
You know, I've got it on tape.
You have your own opinion?
I have it on
Yourself.
tape. I'm giving my opinion.
Yeah.
Just say what you gotta say.
No, I doubt it.
Okay, and there is a certain decorum which I believe that we can maintain here, and it's not all that hard to do. And sometimes it's hard to formulate something into a question, but see, we do have our rebuttal period where we can express for or against the speaker, and that's the appropriate time, and then they get to answer if we brought up any issues. So I think we really need to concentrate on that. And I think with regard to climate change and health care, these are big issues that we can throw a lot of money at, and I think we have a grave situation where we can do serious damage to the economy and to any kind of recovery underway, giving the type of focus that perhaps would make you feel a little more secure. But I know from my standpoint, I've been involved in research since the late 80s and met people who invented devices that were clearly over unity. And all that happens is the government comes and picks the stuff up and shuts them down. So we've got problems on many levels here. You're trying to get us to have a more efficient, less oil usage, but it's a complex issue too. I know there was one environmental scientist who actually pioneered the killing of elephants in Africa. After he'd had about 40,000 elephants slain, he figured out he was making desertification worse there, that the elephants actually were contributing to the grassland, and he was very sorry about it. So, I mean, there are a lot of things going on in the climate change area that are questionable science, are bad science, and there's so much funding going into it that I don't think we're getting honest answers there. Especially when people regularly tell me that in Tier 1 science in some of these black projects areas, they already have free energy, they already have anti-gravity, they already have a lot of things that if we could have that in our society now, it would literally transform life here on Earth. And the fact we're not getting it, that, you know, somebody out at L3 or McDonald, you know, what's the big contract, Lockheed? Skunk Works, all these different, you know, these different agencies, they get the technology we're not allowed to have. So somehow or other, with artificial intelligence coming in and all these different things, we need to be able to maintain a working and economically healthy country. And it's a big, very complex issue. Thanks.
I don't disagree with our speakers tonight. Big money and gerrymandering are definitely issues, and they need to be dealt with. But even if we solve those, the assumption is that the votes are being counted correctly at the ballot box. And that, to me, is the bigger issue. What I mentioned earlier going on in Broward County, and this was a Democrat running for a Democrat primary against Debbie Wasserman Schultz, And all he wanted to do was see the ballots, and they wouldn't show them to him. And when he tried to force them to do it through legal means, the ballots got destroyed. That's not just happening there. Laura Presley ran for council in Austin a few years ago, and she was leading her opponent by something like 60-40, which is pretty much a guaranteed win. But somehow she lost. So she wanted to see the ballots, and they wouldn't let her see them. And she ended up filing a lawsuit, and it went all the way up to the Texas Supreme Court. Now, I don't care if you're a Republican or a Democrat. I want the ballots counted correctly at the ballot box. Beverly Harris has a website called blackboxvoting.org, and what she discovered is that with a lot of these election machines, voting machines, which happen to be controlled by a centralized computer, there is something called fraction magic, where the person that controls the centralized computer can turn a switch and just pretty much get whatever vote they want. And she's trying to expose this. And if you go to her website, blackboxvoting.org, she's got a long essay, I guess, on there where she's talking about different instances of where people wanted to get the ballots and look at them and they couldn't do it. Now, I think in Laura Presley's case, she went to the Secretary of State, who I think was a Republican at this time, and I don't care if they're Republican or Democrat. And the Secretary of State was telling local voting districts, you don't have to follow the election laws. You know, you can take your ballots and just kind of burn them or throw them out in the trash or whatever. And which I think is pretty much illegal. But somehow they get away with that. And there's a lot of this going on. A lot of it going on. And Project Veritas had a video of a guy, Scott Fovel, who was a Democrat operative. And again, I don't care if it's Democrat, Republican, Independent, or whoever. And he was bragging about, you Republicans accuse us of busing illegal voters in, and well, we don't care if you do anything about it because we're gonna find some other way to do it if we don't bust them in. And that's my issue. My issue is I want Stalin said, it doesn't matter who votes. What matters is who counts the votes. So it doesn't matter, even if you solve the money problem and you solve the gerrymandering problem, if somebody is manipulating that switch at the central voting place, it doesn't matter. They're going to get what they want. And I heard a story some years ago where, I forget who was, some political operative was talking to someone who was apparently new into politics, and he said, "Yeah, do you want to talk to somebody in politics? You want to talk to a governor or whatever? Just name the governor, and I'll get you into him and talk to him." He was perfectly confident that all of the governors were part of his cabal of people. He knew people were manipulating the vote and putting those people in, and he was so supremely confident that his people were in office that he could promise this political operative that I can get you an audience with any one of these governors. That to me is scary. So, I mean, even if you solve the money problem, the gerrymandering problem, which are problems, I mean, I don't discount that. But you've got to make sure the votes are counted accurately, and that is a big problem.
Thank you very much for this effort that you're doing. I just think it's wonderful that you are doing this, and you're probably going to do well with it. There are several issues that you brought up that I completely disagree with, but I hope they don't interfere with what you're doing. One of them that I will address is the so-called climate change. And I know you said that's your most important issue. Years ago, I used to call up on the internet a little thing on YouTube, the global warming myth. And it was by two groups of scientists who were, I don't know how they do this, but they were going down through the layers of the earth back millions of years. And at each layer, they could determine, one group, how much CO2 was in the air, and the other, what the temperature was at that time. And they were doing this, and they each had a sine wave that kept doing like this throughout the centuries. And they were pretty even. And the other group had a sine wave like that, and then they met each other and realized they were studying something that was related. They superimposed their sine waves, and they found, to their astonishment, that the rise in CO2 always follows the rise in temperature by 700 to 1200 years, and the fall in CO2 follows the fall in temperature. Now, the air has the least heat retention capacity, so when the sun changes, it goes up and down fastest. Second is the ground, and third is the water. Water has the greatest heat retention capacity. And water, absolutely, given temperature and pressure, will absorb a certain percentage of any and all the gases that combine the air. And the colder the water gets, the more it absorbs the gases. So the water cools down the slowest after the temperature falls, then it begins to absorb gases including carbon dioxide, and just the reverse, it begins to release after the temperature has gone up. This was on the YouTube. I used to be able to click on it and go to it, and then one time I went to it, global warming myth, and I got something like 280,000 hits. And I went through a few hundred of them and realized I'll never find it again, because it's been totally covered up with all of this other garbage. And then years later, I found the URL site where I had originally seen it, and it had been removed from the internet. A lot of study has been done on this. Al Gore was going to become a billionaire on the carbon credits for the carbon tax to try to stop the carbon emissions, and the term greenhouse gases was invented to put forth this big myth. He was expecting to become a billionaire over carbon credits. And Obama, I read, was expecting about 58 million out of his investments in that. Then some people had hacked into the internet traffic between scientists in the United States and Europe, and they realized they had just put together a big conspiracy on this thing, and it was all for that carbon tax, and that's all it is. The Earth constantly rises and falls in temperature. I've been looking at one site, you can look at it, it's called Florida Maquis, M-A-Q-U-I-S. The guy has this, Google Earth camera system where you can go look at, he's been doing a lot of study of the South Pole. And he's run across maps from 1500, like the Piri Reis map that actually, I think, a number of people who sailed around the world during that time used. The Piri Reis map was copied by Admiral Piri Reis back in the 1500s from a much older map, and it shows the exact outline of the shoreline of Antarctica, which we couldn't see until we had radar that could penetrate through a mile or 2 miles of ice to see it. But they saw it, and then on some of these old maps there are drawings of people wearing just little short pants and having a spear, and growth all over the whole of Antarctica. Antarctica has only been covered with ice in very recent terms. It's not all that ancient. And it changes very rapidly. All of the planets in the solar system are rising in temperature right now, just like the Earth, and falling just like the Earth. And we know that because we have the technology to put thermometers on every one of them. I've looked into a lot of this hidden science stuff, like John mentioned, all of my life. And I've had my brother-in-law, who was well educated with a degree from MIT, say, Albert, you need to go find a psychiatrist. Well, here years later, my sister said, well, you know, some of those things that you used to talk about are coming true. They are coming true, but that is, yes, that is the one issue that I say is your Achilles heel. And I love what you're doing. I support it 100% because I think the greatest opioid, as I've said a dozen times here, is the combination of greed and lust for power. And the more power they get, that means the more money they'll be able to get. Money drives it all. It's materialism.
Well, two ladies, thanks very much. It was a very stimulating talk. We brought out some very vociferous folks, and that's pretty usual, so you shouldn't be alarmed at that. Actually, this is what this place is for. So I generally talk about coming from England. I naturally have a sort of a slightly biased view of things. Yeah, I think actually the hope of the country is in the young folks. I mean, they are really getting a raw deal. It's not only just in America, it's really across Europe as well. They really, there was a day in England where education was free, right through to graduate and postgraduate. And I benefited from that. No more. Only little countries like Finland can educate 5 million people can educate its citizens for free these days. So yes, and of course, yes, I think climate change is an issue, whether it's cyclical or not. It's happening, and will have a bad effect. So I mean, if we can mitigate it, it's well worth doing, because half the major cities will be underwater if this goes on. Once upon a time, the Sahara was a fertile land, actually, and now it's a desert. So yes, we have seen drastic things go on. Now, going back to economics, well, those of you that, of course, read the Communist Manifesto will know that what Marx said was that the elite will always capture the government, and they always do. And we see this. In fact, really, to call America democracy really is a laugh. I mean, democracy means that the will of the people actually govern. Well, in this sort of setup where basically what you have is a kleptocracy. That's what it should be called. Basically, the rich are stealing the work outfit of the working people, and we've seen it. They're getting wealthier and wealthier. The facts are indisputable, actually. There are many things that have gone wrong, and you could go right back to the beginning, as I often tell the folks here, that look, I disagree with the founding fathers, and they copied the political setup in England 300 years ago, after the 1688 Glorious Revolution. So basically, they wanted a king. They didn't want a hereditary king. They wanted an elected king with those powers. Also, the new thing was to appoint a Supreme Court. Well, England did without a Supreme Court until Tony Blair came along and decided it was a good idea, because you had these geriatrics who would sit on the Supreme Court and favor the elite, okay, and bypass government. Supersede government. Well, look, the House of Commons really nowadays does run things, and that's what it is. It's the elected, very common people. Actually, you don't get many millionaires, in the House of Commons these days, and so legislation does get passed that favor the people. Now we do have a House of Lords, and the House of Lords was the Lords. I mean, they are actually owned land. Being a lord meant a slight parcel of land was yours. And the serfs on it worked for you and served in your manor. Well, no more. The House of Lords now, like Danny Blanchflower, who was an economist in America, he sat on the committee, financial committee of the Bank of England, but he also teaches in America. He's now a lord. So you have lots of people, and also what they do actually is challenge legislation. For example, when the Tory party, under its austerity plan, decided to cut back on, benefits to the very poorest, the House of Lords says no. That's plain immoral. And so yes, there are checks and balances like that, but it's totally different to this American checks and balances, really, which is in my very, very strange, very, very, very strange indeed. I don't think any other country quite has it set up, with good reason. Things have gone off. I think when you have this kleptocracy, our friend, I think Margaret's not here, but we used to have a guy called Jeffrey who would say, for example, if I had a 25-year-old broken down truck, they'd want that as well. Their greed is amazing, actually. And of course they use their money to get what they want. I mean, certainly, if they're paying the bill, they certainly will get what they want. So I think it's not just a simple matter of ballot rigging and gerrymandering and all the rest of it. I mean, this goes right back to the way this country was set up, actually. And I think it was set up on a false promise, actually. This checks and balances system, doesn't work too well. And of course it used to be, I understand, a country where you had bipartisanship. Well, you don't see that much anymore. Politics has got more and more, bipartisan, and things are just not, the things that should get done aren't getting done. And I think that the young people recognize that. So my vote is for the young people, if they can. So maybe we do need a single issue third party that will stress these things. I think it is important. But the big thing is we just don't have democracy.
First off, Anne and Joan, very good presentations, and I thank you for the work that you are doing on behalf of our country, or whatever it may be, in the efforts to get it back to, hopefully the ideals and governance that our founding fathers had in mind for us in the first place. Unfortunately, I think that with all of the money that's in politics today, I think it's also very deliberately designed to cause, this divisiveness that is among us now. And I agree with you, Joan, as it relates to the young people and them getting angry and upset about what's going on. Getting them to the polls can be a problem, obviously. But the one thing that I do admire about the youth of today is their tolerance levels. They're colorblind. This generation more than any other generation. And that gives me a lot of hope, because that certainly feeds into what our founding fathers had in mind in the first place, i.e. equality and pursuit of happiness for everyone. And anyone that thinks that this country should operate solely on this myth of free enterprise, when it obviously isn't free, only to those who want to set up the enterprise in the first place, then it's totally free. We suffer the consequences of that every day. So hopefully with efforts such as your own, we will get back our country
to what it was meant to be in the first place. Okay?
Anybody else? Tom? Okay, I'm short. Well, Lorraine gave me my in here, so I'm speaking in behalf of free enterprise and what we can do. One thing to remember about corporations, not only is it wrong to be giving corporations persona status, but realize a corporation is just a mask. It's just a legal fabrication. Behind that corporation are individuals. Many of corporations are characterized as, put together as limited liability corporations, which means that our government is giving them license to go out and do things without the responsibility for the consequences of many times what they do, what they pollute. My beef with a lot of the green laws goes back to some debate over the Kahia Reef some years back. I was corresponding with some indigenous Hawaiians, and they were being pushed by Greenpeace to make the reef a UN biological zone or something like that. I forget the exact terminology, but so one of the Hawaiian ladies sent me a copy of the treaty that they were trying to get them to sign. And I did what I had learned in some legal seminars. I read the treaty from the back forward. All the treaty was doing was removing their indigenous rights to that property and allowing the oil companies to come in and drill on their reef and just pay a tax to do so. And that's all it was about. It was really about giving up their native land and their native heritage there. And so I sent my analysis back, and Victoria Takamini sent a note back. She said, some of our Huna elders agree with you. But they went ahead and they voted, and they gave up their native land. I think we're all in a situation where by various means, for various subterfuges, we give up some part of what is our real heritage. And so I applaud the ladies what they're doing here. I think we really do have a bipartisan issue in this. I think it concerns everybody. It's a sacred duty. Even if you say, okay, you're going to lose, you're not doing it the right way, whatever. You know what? It's citizen action. And the more we belligerently claim our rights, as the founder said, being a belligerent claimant of your rights, the more we do that, the more liberty we garner going forward, whether we have success or failure in this issue. Thank you very much for your
To Joan and Ann, I don't consider myself an expert in American Promise, but this group says one fool at a time can get up and speak, and although I'm not a total fool, I'm not a total, I do have a voice. And when that's one thing I like about this group. They said when President Trump was elected that there were so many people that felt they were not being heard, period, that they thought they'd give him a try. And I thought, well, sometimes it's hard to listen to some people who have very different views from mine here. But we are tolerant, and we do practice tolerance, and people are heard here. That's one thing about it. People are heard. So, and you learn to listen to other people. My comment is about the democratic process. I've heard experts say that democracy is not a cakewalk. You have to participate in order for it to work. And they said in the early Greeks, people met 40 times, whole communities met 40 times a year to discuss issues. That's how the process worked. It's work to have a democracy. So if you want to have hope, if you're feeling like nothing's going to work, hope is an action. We have to do hopeful things if we want to have hope. So I agree with John on the citizen, what was that term you used, John?
Belligerent claimant.
No, something else, citizen something. Anyway, I guess that's pretty much some of the basics of all I have to say today. I do appreciate when people give their, where they got their information. Ken gave several tonight, Project Veritas, the Black Box, voting.org, Fraction Magic, and ALEC. Those, I benefit from this group because, oh, Tom, would you turn that off for me, please? I'm sorry.
You timed yourself.
That was slipped over from the last one. I do benefit from this group because I have a lot to look up. Every time I leave, I have a lot to look up and research and learn about. And I do want to thank them for coming tonight very much. Thank you.
I guess I'm the last one standing. Anyway, I want to thank our speakers. I think they did a terrific job here. Yeah, it's all thinking. What time is it? It's almost 9 o'clock, and we're usually done by now. But anyway, there's a lot to be said. There's I forgot what I wanted to say. It's sad. You get up here and you forget what you want to say. It's one of those things. Senior moment. Maybe that's it. Anyway, I had something in my mind and it was gonna say it, and
It was brilliant.
It was brilliant. Brilliant, yeah.
No, actually, getting his ladies here tonight was brilliant.
Yeah. Anyway, I'm gonna give up on what I was gonna say and give you, you get the last word, you get to comment on all the comment here and close this meeting, so.
Can I say something?
You both have something to say. You get the last word. You get the comment on the comment that all these people said and you get the last word.
I love history. And, you know, I spent time studying English history and came to realize I knew more about English history than I did American history, so I started reading about that. But what I want to say is that what Winston Churchill said, and I'm just going to paraphrase it, democracy is a terrible form of government, except for all the rest. The other thing I'd like to say is I think we forget that our democracy is an aspirational concept. And our founding fathers knew that. And what they would want us to do is to participate just the way they did, because we can make it whatever we want it to be. And if it's not the way we like it, shame on us if we're not out there working to create it. And as many people have said, it's not a spectator sport. I have a very close friend who's Scottish, and she just became a U.S. citizen. And I went to the ceremony, and first thing I told her was, okay, step up to the plate. It's up to you to make this what you want it to be. So thank you all for inviting us.
And I'll just finish by seconding that note of thanks. Y'all are a very attentive audience. As a speaker, I really appreciate that. I appreciate your smart, thoughtful questions. This has been a really interesting evening for both of us, so thank you again for inviting us. We appreciate it.
Well, that's it for tonight. They kick us out of here at 10:30. Our speakers are still here. We're going to talk to them. And,
She gets up at 4 o'clock.
All right, anyway, they're still here. We're going to talk to them. And in any case, we'll see you all next week.
Yeah, she's a real early bird. She gets up every morning and goes and swims. By the time I get up, she's already been up for 3 hours.